Welcome to DC Insiders, where we bring you sharp views about global issues with relevance to Taiwan from the political capital of the world here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. U.S. export controls have direct and indirect impacts on Taiwan, driven largely by the evolving regulatory environment, rising U.S.-China strategic competition, and Taiwan's critical role in advanced technology sectors, especially semiconductors. Changes in the U.S. controls directly affect technology transfer, licensing, and investment for both U.S. and Taiwanese industry players. To further understand the U.S. efforts in export control policy and its future development and potential impact, we're speaking to Kevin Wolf, former Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Industry Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce. So welcome, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining us. As we know, the recent Trump-Xi summit, one of the biggest focus was on the export control of rare earth. I think the world sort of breathed a relief that both sides agreed to a temporary sort of 1-year pause on this ban. However, there seems to be different readouts on both sides.
Oh, I don't have any inside knowledge as to Beijing, so I can't help you there. But I can put the agreement to withhold the imposition of controls on rare earths in connection with the U.S. decision to not impose controls on affiliates of listed entities. That is completely novel. Nothing like that in the history of export controls has ever happened, where there was a specific action to impose controls by another country and our decision to not impose a control as part of a deal. And an arrangement. And so there's a lot that we don't know what's going to happen. The Commerce Department published the implementation of its rule, suspending for 1 year rules that it had published in September, saying that any subsidiary, any entity owned 50% directly or indirectly by a sanctioned entity on the entity list was subject to exactly the same controls. Some estimates I saw in industry were that it would be as many as 20,000 or more actual entities that became for the month subject to prohibitions on exports. And now those are suspended. We've gone back to the day before September 29th in terms of what the rules are, at least for a year, or unless something in the interim happens that the deal goes south. So in terms of the difference between the two sides, I have no idea, but in terms of the implications for it, it makes things really interesting from a compliance attorney's perspective.
So what do you advise companies to do?
Well, we're still working through that because it is true that diversion of items that are controlled going to sanctioned entities is a very serious issue. It always has been.
Yeah.
And so I applaud the administration trying to think aggressively and proactively about that. But the thought was that just by virtue of being an affiliate alone was the diversion risk. And now they've removed that in exchange for something unrelated, which is the ability to get rare earths and other minerals into unrelated industries in the U.S. So in the meantime, because it is a legitimate issue, and rules that I put in place when I was there was if you're doing business with an affiliate of a listed entity, you should per se treat that as a red flag, that there is a diversion risk associated with it, and it requires companies to do a lot more work to make sure that the companies that they're doing business with aren't going to divert the items that are subject to the regulations to their listed parent. So all that will continue, but what this has done is it's sort of highlighted the need to have extra due diligence in place to prevent the diversion, even if there isn't actually a legal requirement or a prohibition on doing business with the affiliate.
So we kind of jumped right into the very detailed regulatory issues. Let's pull back a little bit, right? Sort of the genesis of China's imposing rare earth ban, export control to the rest of the world. Maybe you can just explain a little bit about sort of China's dominance when it comes to rare earth and processing.
Historically, China has had an advantage there because of its willingness to subsidize and have lower environmental standards and mine and do the harm to the environment that's necessary to pull out of the dirt that which is needed for magnets or other types of metals. And as a result of that, that's built up over several decades, given the criticality to just almost literally anything that exists that contains metal. That has given them advantages, leverage in terms of policy, and they used it. It's not that the same metals don't exist in parts of the United States or parts of Australia or parts of Canada. It's just that those countries, the allied countries, haven't been as willing as China has over the last couple of decades to literally dig deep and do what's needed and create the processing infrastructure in order to mine that. And so that's where the advantage is, as opposed to any sort of, as far as I understand it, any particular advantage with respect to geographic location on the planet. It's directly tied to making anything that exists.
How are export controls, since you're the expert on export controls, integrated into sort of the broader trade negotiations, and what risks and opportunities do they present for national security these days?
And historically, they've never had anything to do with trade talks. They've never, and what I mean by that is the system that we have today, and the structure of it, was basically born at the end of the Cold War as a non-proliferation system. That is, the US and other producer nations, partners and allies, came together and said, what are the weapons of mass destruction? What are the parts and the components and the technology and the software that are necessary to produce, develop, or use those things? So let's US and other allies come together with all these technical experts and create lists of what those items are historically. And all export controls exist to serve a national security or foreign policy objective. And historically, that was the national security objective. I mean, for decades and decades. They were not something that was negotiable. And every administration, Republican and Democrat, have said the two are unrelated. So to answer your question, how do they integrate with trade talks? They never have. This is all a grand experiment that we've never seen before. It's not necessarily per se bad. That's my point. And the reason for that creative new thinking is needed is that we're no longer in 1996. We're no longer in a straightforward world. We're no longer in a world where supply chain security is not so much of a policy issue for the United States. And economic security issues are far more complicated than that very sort of simplistic view. I mean, it's complicated, but simplistic in terms of objective view that's dominated for 30 years. And so starting really during the first Trump administration, there was in the community a fairly broad discussion about how should we be thinking about export controls more broadly. And the realization, I think universally within the academic community and the export control community, that just focusing on narrow non-proliferation objectives didn't address China's military civil fusion policy, which is to acquire items of widely available commercial utility that are needed by China to advance its economy to the detriment of the United States, and to enable the emerging technologies that are needed for its military to modernize. And also the human rights aspects of it, less so discussed today, of commercial items being used for mass surveillance or genetic surveillance not being an issue. And then, as Jake Sullivan described in the previous administration in September of 2022, the nature of emerging technologies are such that they enable the development of all others. And sort of the intellectual shift that sort of happened in the discussion is that for 30 or so years, when people would think about controls, including me, is they look at 1 degree of separation away from the item. This is the weapon. What are the things that are needed to make that weapon? And then regulate the hell out of those items for end users and end users and countries of concern. And so what the thinking is, well, it's not just the parts or components that go into the weapon. It's the computer that needs to design the advanced components. It's the algorithm that's needed to create the outputs for that. It's the chips that are needed, et cetera. And it's the tools to make the chips and the people to make the tools, et cetera. And so where you draw those lines without having a control system that is more harmful than helpful, that is counterproductive, that gives advantages to foreign competitors over US companies and still advances a broader national security objective is really what the debate is about. So there isn't an answer yet. There are lots of people with opinions, but there's no bright line answer yet as to what the new objective of export control should be. And what I mean by that is that most of the allies, the way their export control systems are structured and the way their people, their policy people think about controls is very much exactly the same as it was in 1996. 1996 is the year the Wassenaar Arrangement was created and implemented, which is the multilateral post-Cold War arrangement to implement controls on dual-use items and commercial items that have, even though commercial, some relevance to the development or production of a conventional weapon. And the intellectual shift that occurred at the end of the Cold War is, no, we should just focus on these narrow, specific non-proliferation
And now
objectives.
we're expanding again.
And the difference is, whenever you impose, there's a history, there's a truism to a unilateral control, which is if you impose a control on your industry and the government of the competitor's industry doesn't not impose the same control, and you as a government don't have the ability to assert foreign jurisdiction over that foreign item, what you're doing is creating an incentive for that foreign company to ship to the detriment of your companies. And it doesn't stop anything going to the bad end use or the bad end user. And so something that I've been advocating in is a broader thinking, not just within the US, which is clearly happening, but among the allies to think differently about controls, but do it in a way that doesn't end up disadvantaging US industry and doesn't giving advantage to non-US industry, and at the same time not having any impact on stopping the things that you want to stop. And so far that hasn't happened yet.
So what are the key differences between this Trump administration's use of export controls vis-a-vis when you serve?
So we were at the tail end of what I call that sort of classical objective and purpose for export controls, when most people had no idea what I did for a living, and I didn't get invited to things like this. People weren't really.
People didn't pay attention.
People weren't paying any attention to it, and the world is now different. And so a lot of people are thinking about. A lot of clever, creative minds are getting in to thinking. So the main point is that we had a clear vision at the beginning of our administration, which was to make trade easier with the allies on defense trade and dual-use items. The system was basically regulate everything, everywhere, all the time, always, and we were spending as a government most of our time processing licenses for close allies, aircraft parts to Germany and Japan. And so when you
still requires licensing.
Well, but at the end of my time there, we created a lot of exceptions with respect to less sensitive items, including some military items going to close allies for use by those governments in those countries. And that was the signature sort of accomplishment of our administration, was to free up the amount of government time being spent, which was the majority of time, on trade with allies, and spend more of our policy time and investigation and enforcement resources on countries of concern. And emerging technologies. First answer was, there was, one, it was the sort of classical mindset. We were very much aligned with the allies as to the purpose, and we had a very clear instruction and vision as to what we were supposed to do for the 8 years. And so that's one. And every administration takes a little bit of time to figure out what their vision is going to be. It took the Obama administration about a year to sort out what I just described. The Biden administration took about a year to get to what eventually became a coherent policy that was described in the fall of 2022 about the per se threat that comes from indigenous Chinese capabilities and certain technologies. And so we're still very much in the first year of the Trump administration, and there have been a handful of individual actions like the one we were just speaking about. But I'm still waiting for sort of the grand vision as to the objectives to be achieved.
I think you've outlined 3 major schools of thought. There's those China hawks, how they think about those policies. There's flood the zone type, and then there's the Make America Great Again. Can you explain what the 3 schools of thought?
Because of the supply chain security issues, because of broader economic security issues, because of a broader assessment of the threat that is China, there's one policy group within the administration and in Washington generally, which is a broader decoupling group, which is far beyond just the advanced technologies, far beyond items that have any direct or indirect relevance to the production or development of weapons. We need to make sure that our economies are largely separate and that there are alternatives outside of a U.S.-China relationship.
So what are they advocating for, essentially? Like no exchanges?
Well, I don't think it goes that far. I don't think any of them are suggesting a complete embargo. So, but in some of these key technology sectors, it's not really drawing bright lines between above or below this technical threshold.
So for example, advanced semiconductor chips, no difference than legacy.
Exactly. It's just we shouldn't be providing support to China generally to make semiconductors, period.
Available.
Because they will then dominate the world with respect to cheaper semiconductors and displace U.S. industry. So that's what I meant by like a broader way of thinking about the use of export controls for a broader economic security mindset. So that's one group that's in Washington. Another group that is in Washington is what's referred to as the Flood the Zone camp, and this is kind of reflected in a proposed rule that the Trump administration's Commerce Department published a couple of weeks ago that said we need to make it so that the U.S. AI technology stack dominates, make the world dependent upon U.S. semiconductors, make the world dependent upon U.S. AI technology.
And the thinking is that because U.S. technologies are still the best and people want to use it, and so let's just make it make the world depend on those technologies.
Precisely, and that's how to advance our national economic security. because more money will be flowing into U.S. industry and U.S. designers, more the rest of the world will be displaced. It will prevent the rise economically of competitors, primarily in China. And that's how to advance national security and foreign policy objectives. And that's another school of thought, which is very different than the previous school. And then the third school is, let's just take it case by case by case, deal by deal by deal, transaction by transaction by transaction. And because these are too complicated to lay out into a grand vision, sort of like where we started with the rare earths and affiliates rule, is that's a particular kind of transaction to accomplish a broader objective. And let's not announce any grand plans. Let's just take it case by case, day by day,
that's kind
license
of
by license.
What is happening now?
That is happening. Yes, and so it's not like sort of a grad school kind of academic theory of a vision, but it's a, you know, they would say more pragmatic. Let's just deal with the problem in front of us, and if there's novel, creative ways to solve it, then let's do that, but not tie ourselves to some sort of grand vision. And I don't know which of the three camps, you know, will ultimately prevail or dominate, or if it'll just be ad hoc, you know, from here on out. So we'll have to see.
I want to talk about Jensen Huang a little bit here, and also his company, NVIDIA, because NVIDIA's chips, in my understanding, during the Biden administration, H100 chips were not allowed to be sold to China. And so they downgraded to H800. And then were able to sell until the earlier days of Biden administration, got banned and then got permitted again. And then somehow Jensen Huang, speaking to Trump directly, even got as far as selling more advanced chips potentially. But then that didn't come up in the Xi-Trump conversation. And so a lot of what Jensen Huang has been doing is almost like watched by the whole world, right? Because it indicates what Trump administration's policy is going to look like.
To put in context what you were describing and the way export controls work, is that there's a whole book of technologies, whether aircraft or machine tools or composite materials or semiconductors or computers, and most of them have technical characteristics. If you're above 6 megahertz, you need a license. If it's below 6 megahertz, you don't. Department of Commerce regulates it with the input from technical experts from the Departments of Defense, State, and Energy. And so over the decades, there was an assessment of, we've identified a threat, let's work backwards from that threat and say, what are the capabilities, even for items in commercial applications, that we want to regulate? If it's 4 megahertz, then it's not going to be that big of a threat. And we don't want to like shut down all trade. And so let's try to draw lines. And those are very hard lines to draw. So what you're referring to is in October of 2022, the Biden administration drew a line. A chip of above this particular capability required a license and couldn't go, except for certain end users or end users. And if it's below a certain capability, it could. And because they had a defined objective of cutting off the inputs for that which is critical for advanced AI applications. And so when a company, any company, makes a product that's below a control threshold, that's not evasion. That's not getting around the rules. That's just how the rules work. If the government has a concern,
you draw a line, then you do.
Exactly. You don't, you know, if the
that's a natural response.
If the speed limit is 55, then you drive at 54.
Right.
And if the government decides that, well, actually, there's a bend here and we need to reduce it to 35, then you change the rules. But you don't blame the company for traveling at 54 mile an hour when that was the line. So that's what happened. And the Biden administration had a year to think about it, came up with a different answer. It saw other anxieties or concerns. And so they changed the rules again in October of 2023, and then again in January of 2015.
2025, yes.
What the Biden administration said, you know what? We're just going to regulate all these chips, the whole world, the entire planet, to everywhere, all the time, everywhere, between any company, with a limited exception for 17 allied countries.
You mean the Trump administration?
No, the Biden administration,
on
January 15th. What the Trump administration did in May was to say, we're not going to enforce any of those rules. The thing is, we don't know what's coming in place. This goes to what is the vision, what's the purpose, what's the policy, what's the national security threat to be achieved. The thing to watch with the Trump administration is, what is its concern with AI? What is its policy objective with AI? What is the threat? What is the benefit? Is this something for which the U.S. and the allies can work together, or is this something where the U.S. with its dominance will act alone? But before you decide on the tools or the control, you have to decide what the problem is to be solved. And that's what we're still waiting to hear.
Would you say export controls, generally speaking, have been effective?
But yes, absolutely. I mean, historically, the controls where the U.S. and the Allies worked together and imposed the same controls to prevent the proliferation of the inputs into weapons, there's a lot of evidence that they are effective. Now, no export controls are perfect because there's always going to be somebody in some country with no controls. There's always going to be evasion. And that's where you need effective enforcement to compel. That's what I do for a living, is I help people ensure compliance with the rules, and they do so, one, because it's the right thing to do, but two, for fear of enforcement. They're never long lasting because other countries can start developing indigenous capabilities outside of the control structure, and then that eventually will make those controls less effective.
Can you give some examples?
So in the late 90s, where the US had the worldwide dominance over the satellite ecosystem, unilateral controls were imposed on all commercial satellites worldwide, everywhere, all the time. And one satellite component in one foreign-made satellite that would taint that foreign-made satellite. And so what happened over the course of the first decade is that companies in Japan and Germany and other allies said, oh, we can create this industry and start making competing products. And eventually they would move away from the US supplied content in order to make their own, even if it's more expensive, so as not to have to deal with the regulatory taint of US jurisdiction. So, when I think about control policy, the national security issues are obviously quite serious. There is a need to think more broadly about China. I'm not denying any of that. But what drives me in terms of thinking about what are the best ideas is if they are going to be effective at delaying and degrading whatever the adversary is that you're worried about. But you have to define what that is, and then you have to define, do we have the ability to do so? Is there significant foreign availability of something that any control will become less effective?
So specifically on China, some have questioned the effectiveness of U.S. export controls.
Well, it depends on what you mean by effective, in the sense that, do you want forever to stop a company from producing something overseas, or do you simply want to delay it for a couple of years or degrade it for a couple of years, and that counts as your national security victory? And so there's a lot of equivocation around the word effective. And the other problem with the word effective is that, like in the tool industry, it varies depending upon which tool you're talking about. Some types of tools that are really sophisticated will take a decade or 20 years to be able to replace. And those types of controls are very effective. The types of equipment that can be produced overnight and substituted by a country that doesn't have any controls, that control is only effective for a day. The question of effectiveness, you really have to go almost item by item by item by item and look at foreign availability and how hard it is to replace. At the end, in terms of knowing what you want to do, you have to know what your objective is. Now, to be clear, there are some times where effectiveness is irrelevant, and particularly when you're dealing with broader principles. So, for example, the controls on items for use in human rights abuses, or bombs or other weapons that are obvious. Just because they're widely available doesn't mean that there shouldn't be controls on them. That's also a difficult choice for government officials, is to think and make decisions. Sometimes we should impose a control on something because it's the right thing to do, even though it won't really have any material impact. Thumb screws, guillotines, torture devices, those are all widely available items that can be easily produced anywhere. But the U.S. has decided, we're going to, as a country, decide to prohibit those. And even though it's not actually having any impact on the ability of somebody to buy instruments of torture somewhere.
Well, a lot of the export controlled products or items today very much focused on the development of AI technologies. As an expert, do you see other new export controls being developed to address certain type of technologies, products?
Absolutely. The U.S. and a smaller group of allies, this regime system that I referred to that was created in the 90s, has basically collapsed because Russia is a member and all decisions require a consensus. So in, I think, a really creative move that would be a model even for this administration, the U.S. and a much smaller group of allies came together and said there are other emerging technologies, such as those involving quantum computers, the computers and the inputs and the cryocoolers and the equipment and particular kinds of chips that have inherent sensitivity. And unlike with other things that we've regulated historically, we're not going to wait until the item is produced before we start regulating it, given the nature of what quantum computers can do in breaking encryption, for example. And so beginning in 2024 and moving into 2025, a small group of allies came together and said, you know what, we're going to come up with lists just among ourselves outside this regime process and regulate quantum computers. Other topics that have been discussed, but for which there's not been a lot of activity, are in the biotech space. There were a handful of rules right at the end of the Biden administration, of relatively limited and discrete. That's much harder to get your brain around because so much of the availability is from China or other countries outside the US and the allies, and also identifying what the threat is beyond the obvious bioweapons, which has been regulated for decades. Right. That's another area that I think is going to be require a lot of creative thinking in the next couple of years.
And what do you think Taiwan can play a role in all these conversations?
Well, yeah, I mean, given the obvious in terms of it is the leading producer of 90 or whatever the percent is of most advanced semiconductors and great technologists and scientists and close cooperation such as its fab in Arizona and all sorts of other smart people, with similar objectives, continue on with that close alliance and coordination and cooperation that will be in the common interest of both countries easily.
Well, thank you so much for helping our audience understand export controls a little bit better. Yeah. It's a very complex subject, but clearly being used broadly in power politics in the world. So appreciate your joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for watching DC Insiders. Please follow us on social media to get the latest episodes. See you next time.